Hi, my name is Colby Brown, and welcome to the gear episode of this new video series we are filming with B&H down here in Ecuador. Right now, what I would like to do is actually geek out a little bit and talk about different cameras and lenses that we're using on this trip, because unlike some of the videos I've done in the past with B&H, this time we're actually focusing on both landscape and wildlife. So there's a little bit of crossover, but there's also quite a bit different between the different genres of what we're gonna do. So we have a lot of gear to cover, so let's go ahead and jump right in. So to start things off, let's go ahead and talk about landscape photography lenses. Now, first off, we have the tried and true 16-35 f2.8 G Master lens. Now, this lens is a pretty phenomenal all-around landscape lens. It is something that I've used for years. It is something that we used almost extensively in Bigman Falls for the first video series that I did with B&H last year. You guys should be sure to check it out. So we photographed waterfalls out there. But either way, it is a staple of pretty much all landscape work where you either want to shoot wide open to maybe even shoot some astro, or certainly to take advantage of anything within that 16 to 35 millimeter range. So if you're thinking about experimenting with landscape photography, 16-35 is kind of a staple that you really need to have in your gear bag. Next up, we have the 24-105 f4. Now this is a unique lens because it isn't one that is always recommended for these types of situations, but it is a phenomenal lens. It has great resolving power, it's very sharp. Now it's an f4 lens, which essentially just means that it's not the fastest lens, so you might not use it if you're shooting in really low light situations, unless you're shooting from a tripod. But it is pretty portable. Like I said, it's very sharp, and it covers a nice range with a 24-105. If you pair this with, say, a 100-400 with the Sony system, then you cover effectively 24-400, which is a really great setup, lightweight setup that you can take on a lot of different places around the world, or even in your own backyard, and not have to carry too much gear. Now the new 24-70 f2.8 G Master Series 2 lens, which is this one right here, which is just being released this summer, is a phenomenal lens. This lens gets all of the new technology found with a lot of the new Sony lenses, linear motors, great resolving power. It is also incredibly lightweight and very portable. In fact, for my own gear setup, I actually sold my other 24-70 f2.8 G Master and actually ran with this lens, the 24-105, for a while. And now that this lens has come out and it's not that much heavier than this, I think I'm gonna go back to the 24-70 f2.8 G Master Series 2 because of that portability, because it's so sharp, and because it gives me the flexibility to then use it in those situations where I do wanna shoot in low light situations and I don't wanna sacrifice with shooting at a too high of f-stop. Now, lastly, we have kind of a hybrid option here, which is the Sony 70-200. Now, I mentioned that it's hybrid is because both in landscape and wildlife, I think a lot of photographers don't necessarily think or consider the 70-200 a recommended lens choice because it's a bit unique. When it comes to landscapes, a lot of people are shooting ultra wide. When it comes to wildlife, people are generally zooming in very far. So the 70-200 range is an interesting choice for both, but I think it can be advantageous. When it comes to landscape work, the 70-200 is a great option if you really want to zoom in and isolate your subjects a little bit more. This is the original f2.8 G Master Series 1. The Series 2, which has already come out, is much lighter and much more portable. It's actually my go-to, but because we had a film crew carrying all of our gear down here, I couldn't fit an extra one in my bag. But regardless, it is a great one to use in these types of situations. And then when you think about it from a wildlife perspective, there are times when certain species of wildlife just get much closer to you than you might realize or might expect. And a 400 or a 600, which I typically shoot at for a lot of the wildlife stuff, which we're going to talk about in a second, just not going to work because the minimum focusing range is just too short. So for those situations, I love having a 70-200 for when you get those kind of intimate encounters with wildlife. It can be a great one to have in your gear bag. And like I said, especially if you pair it with one of the newer 70-200 f2.8 G Master Series 2s, it's gonna be portable, it's gonna be super, super sharp, and it'll be a great addition to your setup. Now, when it comes to wildlife lenses, the lenses you typically need to be able to zoom in much further because most species that you're going to try to photograph are much further away. That's just the reality of the situation for most wildlife photographers out there. So starting off, we have the Sony 200-600 f5.6 to 6.3 variable aperture lens. Now, this lens is a great choice, a great affordable choice for those that want to get into wildlife photography and to have that extended reach in the 200 to 600 millimeter range. What's really great about this particular lens is that your zoom focus ring right here in the front that takes you from 200 to 600 is actually incredibly short. And what that means is that you can go from 200 to 600 in just about 2 inches of space in terms of turning it, which means that if you're photographing or focusing on a subject that's very close and then you find one that's quite far away, you can very quickly go from 200 to 600, lock onto focus and get the shot. Now, being a variable aperture lens at 5.6 to 6.3, it is not going to be the best lens for super low light situations, which you may find yourself in because you have that higher aperture minimum range you have to work with. It is something that you just have to take into account. So if you find yourself in a situation where you have enough light and you want an affordable way to get into wildlife photography, 200 to 600 is going to be one of your best choices. Now, one of the lenses that I don't actually have up here that is in a similar vein to the 200 to 600 is actually the 100 to 400 f4.5 to 5.6 G Master lens. Now, that lens is a little bit more expensive than the 200 to 600, but again, covering the 100 to 400 millimeter range gives you quite a bit of good coverage. It's has very high resolving power, so it's very sharp, and it can work very handily for a lot, especially the larger mammals, where you don't need that extra 600 millimeter length in order to photograph, say, small birds in flight or things like that. We didn't have enough space to bring it on this particular trip, but it is a great one to talk about. Now, from there, we have two of the big boys in the Sony wildlife or sports lens lineup. You have first the Sony 400 f2.8 G Master lens. This is a very expensive lens, but is a phenomenal lens choice for a lot of wildlife photographers out there. At 2.8, you can shoot in very low light situations. In the 400 millimeter range, it's going to give you enough coverage to maybe pair with the teleconverters we're going to talk about in a second to give you that extra reach. I find myself using this particular lens in two main situations. The first is if I'm shooting in very low light situations. As I mentioned before, it's dawn or dusk and I don't have a lot of sunlight. Maybe I'm underneath a dense jungle canopy and I have to make sure that I have a low enough aperture in order to get enough light into my sensor without popping my ISO up too high. And the other time I like to use it is particularly when I'm photographing mammals. As I mentioned before, with the 200 to 600 and the 100 to 400, you really don't need that extra range of the 600 millimeter and beyond for a lot of the larger mammals out there. And the 600, which is great for birding, is not necessarily always the best for mammals, because if they get closer, all of a sudden you're going to be completely filling your frame with your shot of, say, a jaguar or an ocelot or a bear, like whatever it is. The 400 might be a better choice for you. So when I'm going on a trip where I know that I'm focusing on those larger mammals or those predators, the 400 is usually what I go with. Now, that leads us to the 600 millimeter f4, Sony's other prized telephoto lens. This is the lens of choice for all birders out there. It is incredibly sharp. It and the 400 are both designed intentionally with mirrorless in mind. And what I mean by that is that really all of the lens elements, all the things that make it or give it its weight and its heft, are all actually geared back towards the camera itself, which is really great because in the past, the first generation of these lenses, it was actually weighted throughout, which means that over time, especially if you're hand holding, you might find yourself dipping down and really hurt your shoulders. So these lenses are a lot more possible to be able to shoot them handheld nowadays. Maybe not for long periods of time, but it's certainly more possible. But either way, it is a great lens if you're photographing birds or like we are out here in Ecuador in the Amazonian jungle, where we really want to give the birds and the species a bit of space so that we are not infringing on their area and we're still coming away with some great shots. Now, next I want to talk about the teleconverters in the Sony lens lineup. You have the 1.4 and the 2x teleconverter. These are great converters that essentially allow you to expand the reach of your telephoto lenses to reach subjects that are quite further away. Now, the trade-off is that for the 1.4, you lose 1 stop of light, and for the 2x teleconverter, you lose 2 stops. When what that means is essentially your minimum aperture changes from, say, an f4 to an f8, something like that. Both of them can work well in a lot of different situations, but you have to remember that once you increase the millimeter range of the lenses you're using, you also have to counterbalance with a faster shutter speed, especially on the non-prime lenses, because you might find yourself getting less than ideal results in some of those situations. Either way, if you do need the extra reach and you're working with one of these lenses that doesn't get you far enough or close enough to your subjects to really fill your frame, try some of these teleconverters. They're going to work great for you. Now, when it comes to the two last lenses I want to cover, both of these are further niche lenses that deserve to be talked about in both landscape and wildlife. Now, first up, we have the Sony 24 f1.4 G Master lens, super portable, very lightweight, and at 1.4, it is a great astro lens. Now, normally I might reach for, say, the Sony 14 f1.8 G Master lens, which is really great for astro, probably my favorite. But those are usually the best to use when you're very close to subjects, because at 14 millimeters, especially if you're using a vertical orientation, the mounts can look very small on the bottom. So 24 gives us a bit better perspective and allows us to fill a bit more of the frame with the Cotopaxi volcano. So hopefully we'll get a chance to show you some of that throughout the course of this trip. Now, next up, we have probably my favorite wildlife lens, which is a little bit weird to say because this is the Sony 90mm f2.8 macro lens. Now, I think a lot of wildlife photographers might say that the 400 or the 600 is their favorite lenses, and I do love those. But in the last 2 or 3 years, I found myself in love with the idea of macro wildlife photography. I found myself traveling all over the world in search of different species of frogs and snakes and insects and all sorts of fun, creepy crawlers out there. So much so that we're actually dedicating an entire video in this series focused on macro wildlife photography. We're going to talk about flashes, off-camera flash, and different setups for you guys. We're not going to cover that in this particular video, but that is definitely coming. Now, of course, you can't get through a gear episode and not talk about cameras. For me, with the Sony camera lineup, you have a lot of different options depending on what you like to photograph and depending on what your budget is. For me, I have kind of gotten rid of just about all my other bodies and actually focus all my attention these days on the Sony A1. And the reason for that is a couple-fold. First, you have 15 stops of dynamic range, just like you do with the A7R series. So you get a lot of details that you can pull out of shadows and the highlights. You get 30 frames per second, which is pretty incredible when you're photographing at 50 megapixels, which is pretty much unheard of when it comes to the vast majority of other camera manufacturers out there. And then you have a truly silent shooting camera that can be fully customized to really fit your needs. So no matter if I'm photographing wildlife or landscape or macro or street photography or portraits, these cameras, 2A1s, can handle pretty much anything I throw at it. It's one of the long-running jokes that you say that some cameras can be a master of all trades, or jack of all trades, but a master of none. These cameras are actually the jack of all trades, the master of all. And so for me, on the vast majority of my trips around the world these days, I carry 2 of these so that I can have 2 lens setups at the same time. When we're out here in Ecuador, sometimes that might mean an astro and an ultra wide like a 1635, or sometimes that can mean when we're out in the Amazon and I want to have a 400 and a 600. Either way, I'll have both camera setups ready to go depending on what I come across, so I have a higher probability to come away with getting the images that I want. So the Sony A1 is my favorite camera that has probably ever been released, and it's something that I find myself using, as I mentioned, pretty much in all 4 corners of the globe. So when it comes to my big telephoto prime lenses, especially the 400 and the 600, you're going to be hard pressed to find most bags out there that can fit both of them at the same time. But for me, I found a perfect solution, which is the Gura Gear backpack. It's called the Kabuki 2.0 30-liter bag that can fit both of these lenses. The 400 can fit in with a camera attached, and the 600 can just barely fit in there. And then you have a lot of little pockets here in the front to get for a lot of different accessories and things like that. But that's kind of my go-to when I need to bring both those big lenses out into the field. For pretty much everything else, I use Shimoda Designs. These bags, they have a variety of different bags out there. This is the Explora series, where you can fit pretty much anything you want to in these bags, except for those super telephoto lenses. They have fully customizable inserts, camera and lens inserts. So for this bag, if I only had a small amount of gear, I can get a small insert that takes up only a portion of the bag, or I can fill it all the way to the top if I buy that insert as well. So I love them because of that portability, because both of these are super rugged. They can take a beating, they can handle the elements, and they do a great job. And sometimes when I'm photographing so many things, I'm on a long trip like this, I'll actually bring both of them so that I can cover all of my ends and not have to worry about not being able to bring my gear out here in the field. So that about covers all the gear I want to talk about when it comes to this adventure in Ecuador with B&H Photo. Now, next week we have our landscape-focused episode focusing on Cotopaxi and the Avenue of the Volcanoes. After that, we're going to talk about wildlife in the heart of the Amazonian jungle. From there, we're going to go into the macro wildlife photography episode, which is probably my favorite one. And then from there, we're gonna dive into doing our editing and post-processing. We have a ton of great videos coming up over the next couple weeks. I hope you guys stay tuned and enjoy the ride.